You can either act on fear or you can act on faith, but you can't act on both at the same time. You have to choose. I think this is why the number one command in Scripture is fear not. Don't be afraid. Fear not, for I am with you. God says that more than he says anything else in the Bible. The temptation when you're afraid is to act out of your fears, but a lot of times it robs you of your prophetic destiny. Think about Saul, for example, in the Old Testament. You remember that Saul, when he was called to be the king of Israel, was facing his very first battle. And as he goes into his very first battle, he was commanded by Samuel to wait until Samuel arrived, and then Samuel would make the sacrifice because he was the priest. But Saul has his troops leaving by droves. As a matter of fact, if you look at the beginning of the passage, the end of the passage, about 80% of his troops left. They were so afraid coming into this battle. And so Saul does what any leader would do in those circumstances. He takes action and he makes the sacrifice. But when Samuel arrives, Samuel says to him that his kingdom will be torn from him because he acted in fear. And he makes a line there to him. He says to him, it was God's intention to establish your kingdom for all time. In other words, it was God's intention that Saul become the one through whom the Messiah was birthed into the world. But because of his fear, he lost out on his prophetic destiny. Fear often robs us of following the pathways of faith and doing the things of the kingdom we were destined to do. This is why we have to deal with our fear. We have to act on faith and not on fear. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking to you today about feeding your faith in this season. What can you do to feed faith when you are naturally feeling fearful? Because even when you fear and you feel afraid, you can still act on faith. So how do we feed our faith? Let me give you a couple of really practical things. First, it helps if you read books that help feed your faith, sturdy your grip on eternity. This week, I was reading Answers to Prayer by George Mueller. It's one of my all-time favorite books. No one in the history of the church that I've ever read understands and grasps faith like Mueller does. And every time I read Answers to Prayer by Mueller, it strengthens my faith. So I read that. I also am rereading my own book, Deep Faith. Same reason. My wife says to me the other day, why are you rereading your own book? And I said, because I don't want to lose any of the lessons God taught me in critical seasons in my life. And so I'm using it to feed my faith. When I'm done with this one, I'm going to go and read Corrie ten Boom's book, Tramp for the Lord. Same thing, strengthens my faith. She's a woman of deep faith. So read books, reflect on Scripture, meditate on Scripture, and pray Scripture that feeds your faith. You know, some days I've noticed during this season of crisis that I get up in the morning, I meditate on Scripture, I pray, I worship, I do all those spiritual activities to really solidify faith under my feet and vanquish fear. And I'm feeling good. But then sometimes by the end of the night, you know, you watch a little bit of news and you hear a lot of disastrous things and your fear starts to get stirred up again. So at night sometimes I pick up my Bible and I pray through a few Psalms. And I've noticed that when I do that, once again, faith starts to arise within me. So take time in this season, not just to starve your fears. We talked about that in a previous video about some things you can do to overcome fear. But take time to feed your faith. Because you can either act on fear or you can act on faith, but you can't act on both. So feed faith, strengthen its grip, and then choose to act on faith to the glory of the King.